Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating what-if scenarios in all of human history. We're going to explore a world where a single moment, literally one split second, changed everything. And I mean everything. The entire 20th century, the world you and I live in today, all of it hinges on something so small, so seemingly random, that when you really think about it, it'll give you chills. Picture this. It's June 28th, 1914. The sun is shining over Sarajevo, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is making what should be a routine official visit. He's in an open-top car, waving to crowds, doing the whole royal tour thing. His driver is supposed to follow a specific route through the city. But here's where our story takes a completely different turn than what actually happened. In our timeline, TAA, the one we're exploring today, the driver doesn't make that fateful wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street. He stays on the main road. He follows the planned route exactly as he was supposed to. And because of that one simple decision, a young man named Gavrilo Princip stands on a street corner, watching the royal motorcade speed past him, his moment of terrible opportunity lost forever. Think about that for a second. One turn, one missed opportunity, and the entire course of human civilization changes. Now, you might be wondering, how can one event, even something as dramatic as an assassination, really change that much? Well, here's what's absolutely wild about Europe in 1914. The continent wasn't just politically tense. It was like a massive clockwork mechanism that had been wound so tight it was ready to explode at the slightest touch. Let me paint you a picture of just how incredible the forces at play really were. Kaiser Wilhelm, the Second of Germany, commanded what was, without question, the most powerful military machine ever assembled in human history up to that point. We're talking about 1.4 million men under arms, with the capacity to mobilize 4.2 million soldiers within just a matter of days. 4.2 million. To put that in perspective, that's more people than live in Los Angeles today, all trained and ready for war. But here's the thing. Germany wasn't alone in this arms race. Across the border, Tsar Nicholas II ruled over 170 million subjects, stretching across 11 time zones. 11. From the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic Circle down to the borders of Persia and China. The sheer scale of these empires is almost impossible to wrap your head around. And then there was Austria-Hungary, where our story begins. 84-year-old Emperor Franz Joseph, AT3, a man who had been on the throne since 1848, watched over 51 million people speaking dozens of different languages. Czech, Hungarian, Polish, Croatian, Italian, German, Romanian, you name it. This wasn't just a country. It was like trying to govern half of modern Europe under one crown. These weren't just statistics on a page. These numbers represented the largest concentrations of organized human power in history, all poised on the edge of catastrophe. And here's what makes it even more incredible. They were all connected through a system of alliances that operated like interlocking gears in what I can only describe as a doomsday machine. Germany's alliance with Austria-Hungary meant that any attack on Vienna would automatically trigger Berlin's response. It wasn't a choice. It was a guarantee written in blood and ink. Meanwhile, France's alliance with Russia created the nightmare scenario that haunted German military planners, the dreaded two-front war. If Germany had to fight Russia in the east, France would attack from the west. And if France was attacked, Russia would mobilize its massive armies and roll toward Berlin. But wait, it gets even more complex. Britain had naval agreements with France that meant London couldn't just stand aside if the continent erupted into war. The Royal Navy, which ruled the world's oceans, would be drawn in to protect French coasts and maintain the balance of power. Now here's the absolutely incredible part, and this is what makes our alternate timeline so fascinating. Remove just one gear from this machine, prevent just one mobilization, avoid just one declaration of war, EKSA, and the entire mechanism grinds to a halt instead of spinning into the destruction that killed over 16 million people in our actual timeline. In our world, that one wrong turn in Sarajevo set everything in motion. Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, Austria-Hungary demanded satisfaction from Serbia, Russia backed Serbia, Germany backed Austria-Hungary, France backed Russia, and Britain. Well, Britain got pulled in when Germany invaded Belgium. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Within years, the old world had destroyed itself completely. But in our story today, none of that happens. The driver takes the right turn. Franz Ferdinand lives. He goes home to his wife Sophie and their 3 children. He probably has dinner, reads some reports, maybe plays with his kids before bed. Just another day in the life of a royal heir. And because of that one ordinary evening, everything changes. You see, what's so remarkable about this moment is that it reveals something profound about how history actually works. We like to think of major events as inevitable. That World War I had to happen because of rising nationalism, imperial competition, the arms race, economic tensions. All of those factors were certainly there, building pressure like steam in a boiler. But here's what historians have come to understand. Even with all that pressure, all those tensions, the actual outbreak of war required a specific trigger at a specific moment. It needed that one spark to set off the powder keg. And sparks, as it turns out, are surprisingly easy to miss. Think about the pure randomness of what actually happened in our timeline. The original assassination attempt failed completely. The first group of conspirators along the planned route either lost their nerve or missed their chance. Franz Ferdinand should have been safe. He was safe, until his driver made an unplanned detour. The Archduke's car had to slow down to turn around after taking the wrong street. It practically stopped right in front of where Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing. Princip later said he couldn't believe his luck, or his bad luck, depending on how you look at it. The most important man in the Austro-Hungarian Empire had literally driven right into his line of fire, but in our timeline, that doesn't happen. The motorcade stays on course. Franz Ferdinand completes his visit, shakes some hands, gives a speech about cooperation between the empire's different peoples, and heads home. Princip goes back to his revolutionary meetings, probably frustrated that his moment never came. The other conspirators eventually drift away from their radical activities. Some get arrested for other minor offences. Some just grow up and get normal jobs. And meanwhile, something absolutely extraordinary begins to unfold across Europe. Without the crisis of war to destroy everything, the great empires of 1914 face a completely different challenge. They have to evolve or risk being left behind by the march of progress. They have to adapt to the 20th century, instead of being shattered by it. This is where our story gets really fascinating, because what happens when massive, centuries-old institutions aren't destroyed by catastrophic war? What happens when they're forced to change gradually, organically, responding to the real pressures of modernization rather than the artificial crisis of total conflict? The answers, as we're going to discover, are both wonderful and troubling. Some changes come much faster than you might expect. Others take agonizingly longer, and some transformations happen that wouldn't have been possible in any other timeline, line ZaroYT developments, so remarkable that they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about how human societies develop and change. We're going to see empires reinvent themselves as federations. We're going to watch revolutions transform into reform movements. We're going to discover how democracy might have spread through negotiation rather than conquest, and how technology might have developed along entirely peaceful lines. But we're also going to confront some uncomfortable truths about the world we're exploring. Progress without pressure moves differently than progress driven by desperate necessity. Some changes that we consider inevitable actually depended on the specific catastrophes of our timeline, and some problems that were solved through the terrible crucible of global war might have festered for decades longer in a more peaceful world. Most importantly, we're going to see how the absence of one great catastrophe creates space for completely different kinds of human achievement, and completely different kinds of human failure. The shot that never rang out in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, echoes through our entire story. It's the moment when history pivoted toward a path we never took, a world we never built, possibilities we never explored. And trust me, by the time we're done exploring this alternate timeline together, you're going to see our own world, the real world we actually live in a completely different light. You're going to understand just how many different paths were possible, how many choices were made, and how the future we're building right now is just one of countless possibilities waiting to be discovered. So, settle in, because we're about to take a journey through the 20th century that never was, and I promise you, it's going to be unlike anything you've ever imagined. So here we are in 1915, and something absolutely remarkable is happening across Europe. Instead of armies marching and empires crumbling, we're witnessing what might be the most fascinating political transformation in human history. These ancient monarchies, Inselpo, some of them centuries old, are facing the ultimate test: evolve or become irrelevant. And here's what's wild. They actually figure it out. Let me take you to Vienna first, because this is where some of the most incredible changes begin. Franz Ferdinand returns from Sarajevo shaken but very much alive, and that close call, knowing how easily everything could have gone wrong, forces him and his uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, to have some very serious conversations about the future. Picture this scene. It's late 1915, and Franz Ferdinand is pacing around, his study in the Belvedere Palace. He's got maps spread across his desk, not military maps, but administrative ones showing all the different ethnic groups within the empire: Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Croats, Italians, Romanians, dozens of distinct peoples all under one crown. And he's thinking, how do we make this work in the 20th century? The answer they come up with is absolutely revolutionary. By 1916, the Austrian parliament witnesses something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. 2. The introduction of the Federal States Reorganization Act. Now, I know that sounds like boring political paperwork, but trust me, this is huge. Here's what actually happens. The empire that had ruled through German and Hungarian dominance for centuries suddenly grants real autonomy to its various regions. Prague gets its own parliament with actual power over local affairs. Krakow gains control over its education system, which means Polish children can finally learn in Polish instead of German. Zagreb manages its own local government. Even the Italian regions get to run their own show. But here's the brilliant part, and this shows you how sophisticated these politicians really were. They don't just break the empire apart. Instead, they create something entirely new, Europe's first multinational federation. Think of it like a European Union, but in 1916, with an emperor at the top, providing symbolic unity while real power flows through democratic institutions. Franz Ferdinand becomes the architect of this transformation. The man who in our timeline never got the chance to rule, instead becomes the father of modern European federalism. By 1920, he's not just the heir to an ancient throne, he's the president of a federal council representing 51 million people in 15 different autonomous regions. And you know what's incredible? It works. The ethnic tensions that had been tearing the empire apart for decades start to ease when people feel like they have real control over their own affairs. Czech nationalists become Czech politicians. Polish revolutionaries become Polish administrators. Instead of fighting the system, they become part of it. Now, let's travel east to Russia, because what's happening there is equally remarkable, just in a completely different way. Tsar Nicholas II is facing enormous pressure for reform, but without the distraction of a catastrophic war, he can actually focus on the real problems his country faces. Remember, Russia in 1914 was already changing rapidly. The country was industrializing at an incredible pace. Cities were growing. A middle class was emerging. The problem was that the political system hadn't caught up with these economic and social changes. But without war to derail everything, that process of political modernization can actually continue. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, H.A., and this is fascinating because in our timeline he was assassinated in 1911, survives to see his agricultural reforms really take hold. These weren't minor changes. They were completely transforming rural Russia. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of collective village ownership of land, individual peasant families could claim their own farms. By 1918, 2 million peasant families owned their land outright. 2 million. These are people whose grandparents were literally serfs, property of the nobles who owned the estates where they worked. Now they're independent farmers, making their own decisions about what to plant, when to harvest, who to sell to. And here's what happens when people own something. They invest in it. Literacy rates climb from 30% to 60% by 1925, because farmers need to read contracts, understand market reports, communicate with buyers in distant cities. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed without the disruptions of war, carries not troops heading to disaster but families heading to opportunity. Picture St. Petersburg in 1920. And this image is going to blow your mind. Electric streetlights illuminate broad boulevards where well-dressed middle-class Russians debate politics in cafes. Their children are attending university at unprecedented rates. The city has become a cosmopolitan center that rivals Paris or London, but with its own distinctly Russian character. The Duma, the Russian parliament, gradually gains real power over taxation and legislation. It's not happening overnight, and it's not always smooth. But by 1925, Russia has transformed into something that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. A constitutional monarchy where the Tsar reigns but doesn't rule, where real power flows through elected representatives. Now, here's what's absolutely fascinating about this transformation. Tsar Nicholas II, DAT, the same man who in our timeline was overthrown and executed by revolutionaries, EDA, becomes remembered as Nicholas the Reformer. His portrait hangs in the Russian Parliament building not as a symbol of oppression, but as the monarch who had the wisdom to share power before it was taken from him by force. But wait, because the most dramatic transformation is happening in the Ottoman Empire, and this one's going to really surprise you. The Young Turk movement, which had already begun modernizing the empire before the war, suddenly has the breathing room to focus entirely on reform instead of military survival. Without the pressures of fighting a multi-front war, they can concentrate on the massive project of bringing a medieval empire into the modern world. By 1920, the Ottoman Empire still spans 3 continents, from the Balkans down to the Persian Gulf, from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean, Istanbul. But it operates under a constitutional monarchy that would have seemed absolutely impossible just decades earlier. Istanbul becomes what Franz Ferdinand had envisioned for Vienna, our bridge between worlds. European investment flows into Anatolian railways. The famous Orient Express doesn't terminate in a war-torn capital, but in the thriving commercial hub of a modernizing empire. Arab provinces gain significant autonomy while still participating in the federal parliament in Istanbul. And here's what's really remarkable. The empire doesn't fragment along ethnic or religious lines. Instead, it federalizes. Kurdish regions get their own local governments. Arab provinces control their own internal affairs. Armenian communities rebuild and prosper under constitutional protections. The empire becomes a model of how different peoples can coexist and thrive under shared institutions. Sultan Mehmed VI, Eik, and later his son Mehmed VII, preside over this transformation not as absolute rulers but as constitutional monarchs. They provide symbolic unity and continuity, while real governance happens, through elected parliaments and professional civil services. Now, I want you to step back and think about what we're witnessing here. 3 of the largest, most powerful empires in human history, are empires that in our timeline were destroyed by war and revolution, instead evolve into something completely new. They become federal democracies while maintaining their cultural identity and historical continuity. This isn't happening because these empires were particularly enlightened or because their leaders were unusually wise. It's happening because they have something that was denied to them in our timeline. Time. Time to experiment. Time to adapt. Time to find solutions that work for their specific circumstances. The pressure for change is still there, all the same forces that were pushing for modernization in our timeline: the growing middle classes, the spread of education, the influence of democratic ideas, the demands for representation. But without the catastrophic disruption of total war, these pressures can be channeled into reform rather than revolution. And here's what's really wild. By 1925, these three empires are actually more stable and more prosperous than the nation-states that replaced them in our timeline. The Habsburg Federation has solved the nationality problem that had plagued Central Europe for centuries. The Russian Empire has modernized without losing its soul. The Ottoman Empire has become a successful bridge between East and West. But here's the thing that really gets me thinking. In our timeline, we tend to assume that democracy had to come through revolution, that empires had to collapse, that the old world had to be completely destroyed before the new world could be built. This alternate timeline suggests something completely different, that evolution might actually work better than revolution, that gradual change might produce more stable results than sudden transformation. These empires didn't just survive, they thrived by learning to bend instead of breaking. They discovered that sharing power actually made them stronger, not weaker. They found ways to honor their past while embracing their future, and that transformation creates the foundation for everything else that's about to happen in our alternate 20th century. Because when you have stable, democratic institutions instead of revolutionary chaos, when you have constitutional monarchies instead of failed republics, when you have gradual reform instead of violent upheaval, everything that follows takes a completely different path. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating questions in our entire story. What happens to revolution when there's nothing left to revolt against? Picture this scene. It's February 1917, and Vladimir Lenin is sitting in a Zurich cafe, unfolding a newspaper that should have brought news of Russian collapse and revolutionary opportunity. Instead, he's staring at headlines about Tsar Nicholas II's latest reform announcement, AMT, universal male suffrage for Duma elections. The revolutionary moment Lenin has spent his entire adult life preparing for has simply never arrived. Now, I want you to really think about what this means. Lenin isn't just any political figure, Weir. He's arguably the most important revolutionary theorist of the 20th century. In our timeline, he led the Bolshevik Revolution that created the Soviet Union, inspired communist movements worldwide, and fundamentally shaped global politics for the next 70 years. But here's what's absolutely fascinating. Lenin's entire revolutionary strategy depended on one crucial ingredient: catastrophic failure by the existing government. He needed the Tsarist regime to collapse under the weight of military disaster, economic chaos, and popular uprising. He needed people to be so desperate, so angry, so completely disillusioned that they'd be willing to tear down everything and start over. And in our alternate timeline, that just doesn't happen. Here's what actually happens when empire doesn't collapse. Gradual change replaces violent upheaval. It turns out that when governments respond to pressure with real reforms instead of repression, when economic conditions actually improve instead of deteriorating, when people see genuine progress in their daily lives, revolution becomes much less appealing than evolution. In Russia, without military disasters to discredit the regime, the Tsar's reformist ministers gain the upper hand. Count Sergei Witty's industrialization program accelerates without the disruption of war. By 1920, Russian steel production rivals Germany's. The country is becoming an industrial powerhouse, but through gradual development rather than revolutionary transformation. And here's what's wild. This creates a completely different kind of social change. Instead of violent revolutions sweeping away the old order, you get the emergence of a genuine middle class with a real stake in the system. Factory workers aren't just wage slaves anymore. They're skilled technicians with savings accounts and property. Peasants aren't serfs or revolutionaries. They're farmers and small business owners. The Trans-Siberian Railway becomes a symbol of this transformation. Completed without wartime disruptions, it carries not troops heading to disaster, but families heading to opportunity. Vladivostok grows from a frontier outpost to a major Pacific port rivaling San Francisco. The railway doesn't just connect European Russia to Siberia, it connects the old world to the new. But let's get back to Lenin, because his story is absolutely crucial to understanding how different this world becomes. The Bolsheviks face what might be the most impossible situation in political history. How do you foment revolution in a country that's actually improving? Lenin's writings from this period, ATU, and historians have found these documents in Soviet archives, reveal a man increasingly isolated from events. His April theses, calling for immediate revolution, gain little support even among radical socialists. The workers he's trying to radicalize are too busy buying their first homes and sending their children to newly built schools. By 1920, Lenin has essentially given up on revolution and started writing agricultural policy papers. Agricultural policy papers. The man who should have changed the world becomes a footnote in the gradual democratization of Eastern Europe. He dies in 1924, not as the father of world communism, but as an obscure political theorist whose moment never came. But here's what's really fascinating. Revolution doesn't disappear. It transforms. The energy that in our timeline went into violent overthrow instead gets channeled into democratic politics and peaceful reform. Socialist parties across Europe gain power through elections rather than insurrection. In Germany, the Social Democrats have become the largest party by 1920. But they're not leading a revolution, they're leading a government. They're passing labor protection laws, expanding education, improving working conditions, all through normal parliamentary procedures. In France, Jean Jaurès, M.A., who in our timeline was assassinated just before the war began, survives to become one of Europe's most influential political leaders. He heads a coalition government that implements sweeping social reforms, universal healthcare, public education expansion, workers' rights protections, all achieved through negotiation and legislation rather than revolution and violence. The working class gets better conditions, but through strikes and bargaining rather than bombs and barricades. Trade unions organize millions of members, but they use their power to negotiate with employers and governments, not to overthrow them. And you know what's incredible? This approach actually works better in many ways than revolutionary change. When reforms come through democratic processes, they tend to be more sustainable because they have broader support. When change happens gradually, institutions have time to adapt instead of collapsing completely. Let me give you a specific example that really drives this home. In Germany, the 8-hour workday becomes law in 1919 through parliamentary action. In our timeline, this same reform came through revolutionary pressure during the chaos following military defeat. But here's the difference. When it comes through normal political processes, employers and workers have time to adjust, to figure out how to make it work practically. The result is that productivity actually increases instead of declining. Workers are less exhausted, more motivated, more skilled. Employers invest in better machinery and organization to maintain output. Everyone benefits, and the reform sticks because it works for everyone involved. This pattern repeats across Europe and around the world. Labor reforms, women's rights, social welfare programs, WEAJ, all the changes that in our timeline came through crisis and conflict instead arrive through patient political work. But here's what really gets me thinking about the nature of historical change. In our timeline, we tend to romanticize revolution. We think of it as the heroic way that oppressed people overthrow their oppressors and create a better world. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes revolution is necessary when reform is impossible. But this alternate timeline suggests something different. That revolution might actually be a sign of failure. It might be what happens when societies can't figure out how to change peacefully, when institutions are too rigid to adapt, when leaders are too stubborn to share power. Think about Russia. In our timeline, the Romanov dynasty ruled for 3 centuries and then was suddenly, violently destroyed. The Bolsheviks seized power, created the Soviet Union, and eventually collapsed after 70 years, leaving behind economic chaos and political instability. In our alternate timeline, The Romanov dynasty celebrates its 4th century by transforming into a constitutional monarchy. Instead of violent revolution, followed by communist dictatorship, followed by chaotic transition to capitalism, Russia experiences gradual evolution toward democratic capitalism. The result is more stable, more prosperous, and ultimately more free than what actually happened. The same pattern holds across Europe. Instead of the violent destruction of old empires, followed by unstable republics, followed by fascist dictatorships, followed by another devastating war, you get gradual democratization of existing institutions. The Habsburg monarchy becomes a federal democracy. The Ottoman Empire becomes a constitutional federation. Even Germany evolves into a parliamentary system without the trauma of military defeat and economic collapse. Now, I don't want to paint this alternate world as perfect, because it's not. Reform is slower than revolution. Some changes that happened quickly through crisis and conflict take decades longer through peaceful processes. Women's suffrage advances more gradually. Racial equality progresses more slowly. Colonial empires persist longer. But here's what's remarkable. When change comes through evolution, rather than revolution, it tends to be more lasting and more stable. The institutions that emerge are stronger because they've adapted gradually, rather than being suddenly imposed. The societies that result are more cohesive because change came through persuasion rather than force. And perhaps most importantly, this alternate timeline reveals something profound about human nature. People aren't naturally revolutionary. They don't actually want to tear down everything and start over unless they're desperate. What they really want is opportunity, security, dignity, and hope for their children's future. When those things are available through existing institutions, even flawed ones, most people will choose reform over revolution. They'll work within the system to improve it, rather than trying to destroy it completely. This has enormous implications for everything that follows in our alternate 20th century. Because when you have evolution instead of revolution, when you have reform instead of upheaval, when you have gradual change instead of sudden transformation, all the other developments, in democracy, in technology, in international relations, follow completely different patterns. Which brings us to one of the most surprising discoveries in our entire journey. What democracy looks like when it doesn't have to be born from the ashes of war and revolution. Picture Berlin in 1925, and I want you to really try to visualize this scene because it's going to challenge everything you think you know about how democracy develops. The Kaiser still reigns, but real power rests with the Reichstag. The Social Democratic Party governs in coalition with Catholic Centre and progressive parties. Streetcars glide silently through tree-lined boulevards where citizens debate politics in cafes and newspapers. The scene that unfolds challenges our fundamental assumptions about political development, IS-8, constitutional monarchy and democracy. Don't clash, they blend into something entirely new. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, how can you have a real democracy with a Kaiser still on the throne? And that's exactly the kind of assumption this alternate timeline forces us to question. Here's what's absolutely fascinating about democratic development when it's not born from crisis and conflict. It can work with existing institutions instead of having to destroy them completely. Without the trauma of military defeat and economic collapse, German democracy grows organically from the institutions that were already there. Let me walk you through how this actually works. The Prussian three-class voting system, AMA, which gave wealthy voters disproportionate power, comes under increasing pressure from an educated and prosperous working class. But instead of being swept away by revolution, it's gradually reformed through legislative action. By 1928, universal equal suffrage operates throughout the German Empire. Every citizen over 21 can vote, regardless of wealth, property, or social status. But here's the brilliant part. The reform happens through constitutional amendment, not revolutionary overthrow. The Kaiser signs the legislation himself, understanding that sharing power actually makes the monarchy more stable, not less. The German military, still influential but not desperate, accept civilian oversight because they haven't suffered the humiliation of defeat. The officer corps, proud of Germany's peaceful rise to European leadership, sees democracy as a source of strength rather than weakness. They become constitutional soldiers, serving the nation rather than just the crown. And you know what's incredible? This model actually works better in many ways than what we saw in our timeline. When democratic institutions grow gradually from existing ones, they have deeper roots. When change comes through persuasion rather than force, it creates less backlash and resistance. But let's talk about something that's going to really surprise you: how women's suffrage develops in this alternate world. Without the pressure of total war to break down gender barriers rapidly, the movement advances more slowly, but perhaps more permanently. British women gain the vote in 1922, German women in 1924, French women not until 1928. At first glance, this looks like a step backward from our timeline, where many women gained voting rights during or immediately after World War I. But here's the crucial difference. The change comes through sustained political organizing, rather than wartime emergency measures. The suffrage movement builds deeper roots, creating lasting institutions that support women's political participation for generations. Instead of getting the vote as a reward for wartime service, women earn it through decades of political argument, organization, and demonstration. The result is that when women do gain political rights, they're better prepared to use them effectively. The movement has had time to develop experienced leaders, sophisticated organizations, and clear policy agendas. Women don't just get the vote, they get the infrastructure to make their votes count. Let me give you a specific example that really illustrates this difference. In Britain, the suffrage movement, led by Millicent Fawcett, RPA, who in our timeline was overshadowed by the more militant Emmeline Pankhurst, DAA, develops into a powerful political network. By 1925, women's political organizations exist in every constituency. Women candidates run for office at every level, and women's policy priorities are central to political debate. This isn't just tokenism or symbolic representation. These are real political achievements that transform how democracy actually works. Now let's cross the Atlantic, because what's happening in America is equally fascinating but in a completely different way. Without European war to unite the country behind presidential leadership, democracy faces different challenges and develops along different lines. Progressivism advances through state-by-state reforms rather than federal mandate. Women gain the vote state by state, starting with Wyoming and spreading eastward, but the process takes longer and creates more regional variation. Child labor laws advance through union organizing and public pressure rather than federal legislation. The federal income tax, passed in 1913, remains modest without wartime revenue needs. There's no massive expansion of federal power, no wartime bureaucracy that continues into peacetime. America remains more decentralized, more diverse in its approaches to social problems, but also more divided along regional lines. And here's what's really interesting. Without the unifying experience of fighting in Europe, American democracy develops more slowly, but perhaps more authentically. Regional differences persist longer. The South remains more conservative, the West more progressive, the Northeast more industrial. But these differences get worked out through political negotiation rather than federal imposition. The result is a democracy that's messier, more complex, but also more genuinely representative of America's diversity. Instead of a strong federal government imposing uniform solutions, you get 50 different experiments in democratic governance, each adapted to local conditions and preferences. Now, let me show you something that's going to absolutely blow your mind about how constitutional monarchy and democracy can work together. In our alternate timeline, several European countries develop what historians call democratic monarchies. Systems where the crown provides symbolic unity and historical continuity, while elected governments handle actual governance. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm III, ACA, grandson of the last Kaiser in our timeline, 2020, presides over ceremonies and represents the nation internationally, but Chancellor Otto Braun and the Reichstag make all the real decisions. The Kaiser can't declare war, can't dismiss the government, can't even appoint ministers without parliamentary approval. But here's what's remarkable. This system is actually more stable than the republics that replaced these monarchies in our timeline. The crown provides a focal point for national identity that transcends political divisions. People can disagree with the government without rejecting the nation itself. Think about Germany in our timeline. After the Kaiser abdicated, the country struggled with legitimacy crises for decades. The Weimar Republic never fully established itself in popular consciousness. Many Germans continued to see it as an artificial creation imposed by defeat rather than a natural evolution of their political traditions. In our alternate timeline, that problem doesn't exist. German democracy grows from German soil. It honors German history while adapting to modern needs. The result is a system that's both more democratic and more stable than what actually happened. This pattern repeats across Europe. The Habsburg Federation maintains the symbolic unity of the crown, while granting real autonomy to its component regions. The Russian Empire keeps the mystique of the Tsar while empowering the Duma. The Ottoman Federation preserves the caliphate while implementing parliamentary government. These aren't contradictions. They're creative solutions to the problem of how to modernize ancient institutions without destroying them completely. But here's what I find most fascinating about this alternate development of democracy. In our timeline, we tend to think of democracy as inevitably conflicting with traditional authority. We assume that democratic progress requires overthrowing kings, abolishing aristocracies, and rejecting the past in favor of the future. This alternate timeline suggests something completely different. It shows that democracy might actually be stronger when it grows from existing traditions rather than rejecting them completely. It reveals that constitutional monarchy might provide a better foundation for democracy than republicanism in societies with strong monarchical traditions. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that there's no single path to democratic development. The American model of popular revolution, followed by federal republicanism, works in some contexts. The British model of gradual parliamentary evolution works in others. But there might be entirely different models that work even better in specific circumstances. As we move deeper into our alternate 20th century, this gentler path of democratic development creates the foundation for everything else that follows. When you have stable democratic institutions instead of revolutionary chaos, when you have evolution instead of upheaval, when you have negotiation instead of conflict, the entire trajectory of human development changes. Which brings us to one of the most surprising discoveries in our entire journey. What happens to technology and innovation when they're not driven by the desperate pressures of total war? The Wright brothers' flyer sits in the Smithsonian, not as the ancestor of fighter planes and bombers, but as the beginning of an entirely different technological story. And trust me, when you see how aviation develops without the desperate pressure of military necessity, it's going to change how you think about innovation itself. Picture this scene. It's December 17th, 1903, at Kitty Hawk. Orville Wright makes the first powered flight in human history, 12 seconds, 120 feet. But in our alternate timeline, that moment leads down a completely different path than the one we know. Without the urgent need for better fighters and bombers, aviation develops along the peaceful trajectory the Wright brothers originally envisioned. They weren't thinking about air warfare when they solved the problem of flight. They were thinking about passenger transport, mail delivery, and commercial cargo. They imagined a world where people could travel across continents in hours instead of days, and in our alternate timeline, that's exactly what happens. By 1925, passenger airlines connect major European capitals on regular schedules. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about this development, TT. The aircraft that emerge are completely different from anything in our timeline. Picture stepping aboard a Junkers F-13 at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport. You're one of 12 passengers settling into comfortable wicker seats with large windows designed specifically for sightseeing. The cabin is spacious and quiet because there's no need to maximize speed or altitude. No military secrets constrain the design. Engineers focus entirely on comfort, efficiency, and safety rather than maneuverability and armament. The result is that commercial aviation advances rapidly, but in completely different directions. Instead of developing faster, higher-flying aircraft that can outrun enemy fighters, engineers perfect reliability, fuel efficiency, and passenger comfort. By 1930, transatlantic passenger service connects Europe and America on a regular weekly schedule. But aviation is just the beginning. When you look at how medical research develops without the pressure of treating massive battlefield casualties, the differences are absolutely staggering. In our timeline, much of early 20th century medical advancement came from desperate attempts to save soldiers dying from wounds, infections, and chemical weapons. Field hospitals became laboratories for surgical techniques. Military doctors pioneered treatments for trauma, burns, and poison gas exposure. In our alternate timeline, doctors and researchers focus on the diseases that actually kill most people in peacetime: heart disease, cancer, and tuberculosis. And the results are remarkable. The Rockefeller Foundation's investments in public health, not diverted by war relief efforts, produce breakthrough results. By 1925, tuberculosis mortality drops by 80% in major cities. This isn't just a statistical improvement. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of lives saved, families kept together, communities transformed. Early cancer research, funded by wealthy philanthropists and government programs, makes discoveries that in our timeline didn't happen until the 1940s and 50s. Radiation treatment for tumors advances 15 years ahead of our actual schedule because researchers have stable funding and international cooperation instead of wartime disruption. Here's what's really wild about this medical development. HER international scientific collaboration continues unbroken. German chemists work with French biologists. British researchers share discoveries with Russian colleagues. American foundations fund studies across Europe. Without national hatreds and military secrecy disrupting scientific communication, breakthrough discoveries spread rapidly across borders. Let me give you a specific example that really illustrates this difference. Fritz Haber's process for synthesizing ammonia, ICAAPAC, which in our timeline enabled the production of explosives that prolonged World War I, IC instead serves entirely agricultural purposes. German chemical companies BASF and Bayer focus their research on dyes, medicines, and fertilizers rather than poison gas. By 1930, synthetic fertilizers increase crop yields across Europe by 40%. The same scientific knowledge that in our timeline produced chemical weapons instead feeds millions of additional people. European agriculture becomes so productive that famine virtually disappears from the continent. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurs in communications technology, and this is where our alternate timeline really gets fascinating. Radio development, not accelerated by military communications needs, advances more slowly but with much greater focus on civilian applications. The technology evolves as a tool for bringing people together rather than coordinating military operations. By 1928, radio broadcasting connects families across continents in ways that would have seemed magical just a generation earlier. Picture this scene. A grandmother in Berlin sits in her parlor, speaking into a radio microphone, and her voice reaches her emigrant grandson in New York City. He responds from his apartment in Manhattan, and their conversation travels instantly across the Atlantic Ocean. Commercial radio networks carry music, news, and education to remote rural areas. Farmers in the countryside receive weather reports, market prices, and agricultural advice. Children in isolated villages listen to educational programs broadcast from university studios. The technology develops as a bridge between communities rather than a weapon of war. And here's what's incredible about this peaceful development of technology, MAI. It often produces better results than military-driven innovation. When engineers can focus on civilian needs rather than military requirements, they create solutions that are more sustainable, more beneficial, and more widely applicable. Take transportation, for example. Without the need to move massive armies and military supplies, transportation technology focuses on civilian passengers and commercial cargo. Railway development emphasizes comfort, speed, and efficiency for civilian travel rather than rapid military deployment. The result is a European rail network that by 1930 connects every major city with fast, reliable, comfortable passenger service. The Orient Express becomes not just a luxury service for the wealthy, but the model for an entire transportation system that makes European travel accessible to middle-class families. Automobile development follows similar patterns. Without military demand for trucks and armored vehicles, automotive engineers focus on civilian cars that are reliable, affordable, and fuel-efficient. By 1925, automobile ownership in Europe reaches levels that in our timeline didn't occur until after World War II. Now, you might be thinking, but doesn't military pressure often drive crucial innovations? Wouldn't we lose important technological advances without the pressure of war? And that's a really important question. There's no doubt that military necessity has driven many crucial innovations throughout history. Radar, jet engines, computers, the internet, all of these technologies had military origins in our timeline. But here's what our alternate timeline reveals. Peaceful innovation often produces different but equally valuable technological advances. Instead of radar for detecting enemy aircraft, our alternate world develops radio navigation for civilian aviation. Instead of jet engines for military fighters, they perfect efficient propeller designs for commercial transport. The key insight is that innovation responds to whatever pressures and incentives exist. If the pressure is military, you get military innovations. If the pressure is civilian, you get civilian innovations. Both can be equally sophisticated and valuable. They just solve different problems. In fact, when you look at the overall pattern of technological development in our alternate timeline, what you see is innovation that's more sustainable, more widely beneficial, and more focused on improving human life rather than ending it. Chemical research produces better medicines and fertilizers instead of poison gas. Aviation develops passenger comfort instead of bombing capacity. Communications technology connects families instead of coordinating attacks. Transportation serves civilian needs instead of military logistics. And perhaps most importantly, international scientific cooperation flourishes instead of being disrupted by national hatreds and military secrecy. The greatest discoveries come from collaboration between researchers across borders, sharing knowledge and resources for common benefit. This creates a foundation for technological development that's both more peaceful and more innovative than what actually happened. When scientists and engineers can focus on solving human problems rather than creating human destruction, the results benefit everyone. As we move deeper into our alternate 20th century, this peaceful revolution in technology creates possibilities that were unimaginable in our war-torn timeline. The stage is set for a world that's not just different from ours, but potentially better in ways that will challenge everything you think you know about progress and human development. Which brings us to the most mind-bending part of our journey, stepping into the actual world that this different history created, and seeing what daily life looks like when the 20th century unfolds without its defining catastrophes. Step into Berlin in 1925, and I want you to really immerse yourself in what you're seeing, because this is going to be unlike any historical period you can imagine. Electric streetcars glide silently through streets lined with chestnut trees that were never cut down for wartime fuel. Kaiser Wilhelm III, grandson of the old Kaiser, presides over state ceremonies while Chancellor Otto Braun manages the real business of democratic government. The Reichstag building bustles, with representatives from across the German Empire's 25 federal states. But this isn't the democracy we know from our timeline. This is something entirely new, a constitutional monarchy that actually works. Walk through the city and you'll notice something remarkable. The architecture tells a story of evolution rather than revolution. Instead of buildings destroyed by war and rebuilt in new styles, you see the gradual adaptation of classic German design to modern needs. New construction blends seamlessly with old, creating a cityscape that honors the past while embracing the future. The people on the streets reflect this same continuity. Well-dressed middle-class families stroll through parks on Sunday afternoons. University students debate politics in cafes that never became refuges from bombing raids. Workers heading home from factories carry newspapers reporting on parliamentary debates rather than casualty lists. But let me take you on a journey across this alternate Europe, because what you'll discover is going to challenge everything you think you know about how the 20th century should have unfolded. Travel east to St. Petersburg, Mainene. And yes, it's still called Street Petersburg, not Petrograd or Leningrad, Mainene, where Tsar Nicholas III rules over the Russian Federation. The Winter Palace still houses the royal family, but the real center of power sits across the square in the expanded Duma building. Picture this scene. Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky, TZB, the same man who briefly led Russia's provisional government in our timeline before being overthrown by the Bolsheviks, heads a stable coalition of liberals and moderate socialists. He's been in office for 3 years, implementing gradual reforms that are transforming Russian society from within. Russian oil fields in the Caucasus fuel European industry without the disruption of revolution and civil war. The Trans-Siberian Railway carries not political prisoners heading to gulags, but merchants, settlers, and tourists heading to Russia's Pacific provinces. Vladivostok has become a major commercial center, connecting European Russia to Asian markets. The social transformation is equally remarkable. Russian universities, no longer disrupted by war and revolution, have become centers of learning that rival Oxford and the Sorbonne. Russian literature, music, and art flourish in an atmosphere of creative freedom. The Russian Orthodox Church maintains its spiritual authority while adapting to democratic governance. Now journey south to Istanbul, where Sultan Mehmed VII presides over the Ottoman Federation, ADA, a democratic constitutional monarchy that spans from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 evolved into lasting constitutional reform rather than wartime dictatorship. Walk through the streets of Istanbul and you'll see something extraordinary, a truly multicultural democracy in action. Arab representatives from Damascus debate policy with Kurdish delegates from Diyarbakir and Greek representatives from Smyrna. The Ottoman Parliament has become a model of how different peoples can coexist and govern themselves collectively. Arab provinces enjoy substantial autonomy while participating in the federal system. The Hijaz Railway connects Mecca to Damascus, not as a military transport line, but as a pilgrimage route that strengthens both economic and spiritual ties across the empire. Baghdad has become a center of learning and commerce that bridges the ancient and modern worlds. But here's what's going to absolutely blow your mind about this alternate world. The global population statistics tell a story that will give you chills. The global population in this timeline reaches 2 billion people by 1925. Exactly what happened in our world. But those 2 billion people are distributed entirely differently. Europe's population is 50 million higher, without the war's massive casualties. Think about that number for a moment. 50 million people, more than the entire population of South Korea today, who died in our timeline, are alive and thriving in this alternate world. Russia alone contains 20 million more people than in our timeline. 20 million. These aren't just statistics. These are entire families, communities, generations that flourished instead of being destroyed by war, revolution, and famine. The United States presents a fascinating contrast. Without massive wartime immigration and industrial expansion, America remains more rural and less centralized. Its population reaches only 90 million by 1925 instead of 115 million. But here's what's remarkable. Those 90 million Americans are more evenly distributed across the country, creating a more balanced development pattern. American cities grow more gradually, avoiding the overcrowding and social problems that came with rapid wartime expansion. The American South develops differently too, without the unifying experience of fighting in Europe to accelerate federal intervention in local affairs. Regional differences persist longer, but they're negotiated through political processes rather than imposed through federal mandate. Now, let me show you something that's going to really surprise you about the colonial world. Without European powers exhausted by mutual destruction, decolonization follows entirely different patterns. In India, the British Raj faces mounting pressure for self-government, but gradual constitutional development replaces violent independence struggle. By 1925, an Indian federal parliament exercises significant autonomy while remaining within the British Commonwealth. Mahatma Gandhi leads not an independence movement but a civil rights campaign for equal treatment of all British subjects regardless of race. His methods of non-violent resistance achieve remarkable success, but the goal is equality within the empire rather than separation from it. The Indian National Congress becomes a major political party within the British Imperial Parliament. Indian representatives sit in the House of Lords. Indian civil servants hold high positions throughout the British administrative system. India becomes a partner in the empire rather than just a colony. In Africa, the absence of European economic desperation prevents the worst colonial excesses. German East Africa, EIT, which in our timeline was stripped from Germany after the war, becomes a model of what historians call scientific colonialism. Infrastructure development and education programs, while still serving European interests, avoid the total economic extraction that characterized our timeline. French West Africa experiences similar gradual development. The École Normale in Dakar becomes a major center of learning for the entire region. African students travel to European universities and return with ideas about gradual political development rather than violent revolution. The key difference is time. Without the pressure of post-war reconstruction and economic crisis, European powers can afford to take a longer view of colonial development. The relationship slowly evolves toward partnership rather than pure exploitation. But let me paint you a picture of what daily life actually looks like in this alternate world, because that's where the real differences become clear. In Berlin, a middle-class family sits down to dinner and discusses the day's parliamentary debates. Their teenage son is preparing for university entrance examinations. Their daughter works as a secretary in a government ministry and votes in local elections. This is a level of normalcy and stability that was impossible during the crisis years of our timeline. In St. Petersburg, a factory worker owns his own small house and sends his children to public schools that actually function well. He belongs to a trade union that negotiates with management rather than plotting revolution. His wife participates in local political organizations that give women a real voice in community affairs. In Istanbul, a merchant family includes members who are Turkish, Arab, Armenian, and Greek, all citizens of the same federal democracy. They conduct business across the empire's vast territories using reliable transportation and communication networks. Their children grow up speaking multiple languages and considering diversity a source of strength rather than conflict. These aren't isolated examples. They represent the lived experience of millions of people whose lives followed completely different trajectories in this alternate timeline. But I don't want to paint this world as perfect, because it's not. Progress comes more slowly in some crucial areas. Women's political rights advance more gradually, without the pressure of wartime emergency to break down gender barriers quickly. Racial equality progresses more, slowly, without the disrupting effects of global conflict to challenge existing hierarchies. Colonial empires persist longer, their transformation from exploitation to partnership, taking generations rather than decades. Some social problems that were resolved through the terrible crucible of war and revolution instead fester for longer periods. Yet when you step back and look at the overall pattern, what you see is a world that's more stable, more prosperous, and in many ways more humane than what actually developed. The absence of catastrophic war created space for gradual improvement instead of violent upheaval. Most remarkably, this alternate world demonstrates that human progress doesn't require human catastrophe. The innovations, the social advances, the political developments that we associate with the 20th century could have happened, and in many cases did happen, without the massive destruction that we tend to think was necessary for them. As we near the end of the journey through this world that never was, one question looms large. What can this alternate history teach us about the choices we face today and the future we're building for ourselves? Here we stand at the end of our incredible journey through the world that never was. And I have to tell you, the view from here is both wonderful and deeply troubling. We've witnessed something extraordinary, an entire century that unfolded without its defining catastrophes. A world where gradual evolution replaced violent revolution, where human institutions learned to bend instead of breaking. Let me paint you one final picture that captures what we've discovered. Millions of lives saved from the trenches of the Somme and Verdun. Entire families that in our timeline were wiped out by war, revolution, and famine, instead flourish across generations. The Romanov dynasty celebrates its 4th century of rule. The Habsburg monarchy transforms into Europe's most successful multinational democracy. German industry leads the world in peaceful competition rather than military conquest. It's a remarkable vision. But as we've learned throughout our journey, this alternate world carries its own shadows, its own moral complexities that we need to confront honestly. Without the pressure of total war to accelerate social change, progress comes more slowly in crucial areas. Women gain political rights decades later in some countries. Racial equality advances more gradually, without the disrupting effects of global conflict. Colonial empires persist longer, their transformation from exploitation to partnership taking generations rather than decades. Think about what that means in human terms. In our timeline, World War I created opportunities for women to enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, accelerating their political empowerment. The war broke down racial barriers as soldiers from different backgrounds served together. Colonial subjects gained leverage over their European rulers who desperately needed their support. In our alternate timeline, those accelerating pressures don't exist. Change comes through patient political organizing rather than crisis-driven necessity. The result is that some injustices persist longer, some inequalities take more time to address. This raises one of the most haunting questions in our entire story. Does human progress sometimes require human catastrophe? Do we sometimes need the terrible pressure of war and crisis to force changes that wouldn't happen otherwise? I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. What our alternate timeline reveals is that there are always trade-offs, always costs and benefits to different paths of development. The catastrophic wars of the 20th century caused immense suffering, but they also accelerated certain kinds of progress. The peaceful evolution we've explored avoided that suffering, but it also slowed certain reforms. But here's what I find most important about this entire exercise. Our journey through this alternate past reveals something profound about the nature of historical change itself. The catastrophic wars of the 20th century were not inevitable products of human nature or unstoppable historical forces. They resulted from specific decisions made by particular people at crucial moments. One driver taking the correct turn in Sarajevo, one assassin missing his moment of opportunity, one diplomat finding the right words to defuse a crisis, one general choosing negotiation over mobilization. The difference between peace and catastrophe often comes down to individual choices made in specific moments. And that realization carries enormous implications for our own time, because we face challenges today that could reshape civilization as profoundly as the Great War reshaped the 20th century. Climate change presents us with choices about how quickly we transform our energy systems and how much disruption we're willing to accept to avoid catastrophic warming. Nuclear weapons force us to decide how we'll manage international conflicts in a world where ultimate destruction is always possible. Artificial intelligence requires us to choose how we'll integrate these powerful technologies into human society. Each of these challenges represents our own version of that moment in Sarajevo, Omeyeme, a point where small choices might determine vast consequences for generations to come. The world we've explored reminds us that every generation faces these kinds of turning points. The decisions we make today about how to address climate change, how to manage technological development, how to resolve international conflicts, how to distribute economic opportunities, ISA, all of these choices will echo through centuries, just as those decisions in 1914 echoed through the rest of the 20th century. But perhaps most importantly, our journey through this alternate past reveals the extraordinary resilience and adaptability of human institutions. Empires that seemed destined to collapse instead evolved into federations. Monarchies that appeared obsolete instead reinvented themselves as constitutional democracies. Revolutionary movements that promised violent transformation instead achieved gradual reform. The lesson isn't that change is impossible, but that it can follow many different paths. There's no single model for how societies must develop, no inevitable sequence of stages that every country must pass through. Human creativity and adaptability can find solutions that work for specific circumstances and cultural contexts. This has profound implications for how we think about global development today. Instead of assuming that every society must follow the same path toward democracy and modernization, we might look for ways that different cultures can achieve human flourishing while maintaining their distinctive characteristics. The Habsburg Federation showed how multinational democracy could work. The Russian Empire demonstrated how gradual reform could achieve what violent revolution accomplished in our timeline. The Ottoman Federation proved that different religious and ethnic communities could coexist and thrive under shared institutions. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're examples of alternative approaches to perennial human challenges that remain relevant today. But I want to end our journey with the most important insight of all, and it comes from really understanding what that shot that never rang out in Sarajevo represents. History isn't a river flowing inevitably toward its destination. It's more like a vast delta with countless channels, each representing possibilities that remain open until the moment of choice. Every decision we make, individual and collective, opens some possibilities while closing others. The world we actually inhabit, the world of 2 world wars, of communist revolutions and fascist dictatorships, of nuclear weapons and global terrorism, MR, isn't the only world that was possible. It's simply the world that resulted from the particular sequence of choices that human beings made over the past century. Understanding the paths not taken helps us recognize the paths that still lie ahead. It reminds us that the future we're building right now is just one of countless possibilities waiting to be explored through the decisions we make today. When I think about our current challenges, whether it's climate change or technological disruption or political polarization or economic inequality, I'm struck by how often we assume that the trends we see today will simply continue into the future. We act as if current developments are inevitable, rather than the result of choices that could be made differently. But our journey through this alternate timeline reveals something different. It shows us that human beings have far more agency in shaping their future than we often realize. Small decisions can have enormous consequences. Individual choices can alter the course of civilizations. The future isn't predetermined. It's created through the accumulation of countless human decisions, large and small. That's both an enormous responsibility and an incredible opportunity. It means that each of us, in our own lives and communities, has the potential to influence the larger trajectory of human development. The choices we make about how to treat each other, how to solve problems, how to resolve conflicts, how to use new technologies, all of these decisions contribute to determining what kind of world we'll leave for future generations. The shot that never rang out in Sarajevo reminds us that history pivots on moments that might seem small at the time, but prove enormous in retrospect. We're living through such moments right now. The question is whether we'll recognize them as the opportunities they are and make choices that open up better possibilities for the future. Our alternate 20th century shows us what human civilization can achieve when it chooses evolution over revolution, when it builds bridges instead of walls, when it finds ways to honor the past while embracing the future. Those possibilities aren't lost to history. They remain available to us today if we have the wisdom to choose them. The world that never was reminds us of the world that still could be, if we make the choices that create it. And that might be the most important lesson of all.